Okay, so thank you, Sarah. So our last speaker today is Cindy Yielding, and Cindy is Senior Vice President for BP America. She got her master's in geology from UNC. She's leading a working team for the U.S. National Petroleum Council study on CCS. So I turn the floor over to Cindy, and maybe I'll try to help you here. Is it this one?
That looks right. Thanks, Carol.
I'm above average.
Oh, well, here's where Shannon has to help me to make the slides. Okay, look at it. Sorry, we're having a... Okay. Except that we just need to go back about a half a dozen slides. Okay. All right, everybody. The highly coveted afternoon slot, second day of the conference. Room's kind of dark, tiny bit warm, and we are going to tell you about a study that we can't tell you the results of yet. So if all of that sounds super compelling, you're welcome to take off or log on your email or something like that. But what we've opportunity we have here today is to share sort of a preview of a study that's been sort of requested by the Department of Energy through the National Petroleum Council on carbon capture, use, and storage. And the study's been ongoing for about 18 months. The results they are being socialized, reviewed right now, but they're embargoed until mid-December when we can share the results more broadly. So this series of slides today will give you a little bit of an idea of just the basics of carbon capture, use, and storage, and we'll talk about how we're addressing it, the challenge a little bit differently. But I just wanted to kind of cut to the chase. You're not going to get a whole lot of 1, 2, 3 amazing conclusions, but hopefully you get some good insights and some things that complement what Sarah and Shannon have been saying about different fuel sources. So the National Petroleum Council, for those of you who don't know it, it is actually a federal advisory committee, and it exists solely to answer questions or requests from the U.S. federal government. So in 2017, fourth quarter of 2017, the National Petroleum Council received a letter from Secretary Rick Perry, and that letter actually asked that the National Petroleum Council, through its members, has about 200 members, actually offer insights to the Department of Energy and to the U.S. government on what the U.S. could do to scale up in carbon capture, use, and storage. And the critical part about this request is not should the U.S. move forward in carbon capture, use, and storage. It's like, how would we? Leave the should to other people, but how would you actually move forward? There are 5 questions that are really critical to the study. The first is, and these are all kind of a synthesis of Secretary Perry's letter. What's the energy landscape? And Sarah did a good job of setting that up, but I will also add a little bit of complementary information to that. So what's the demand for energy, and how might CCUS be applied in there? What R&D, technology, infrastructure, and economic barriers must be overcome to deploy carbon capture, use, and storage at scale? What does good look like? What actions can the government and private industry take to move forward? Specifically, what regulatory, legal, liability, or other issues should be addressed to progress investment? So that was the request that Secretary Perry gave to us. So we started on this study about 18 months ago. First thing we did is we spent a lot of time looking at that letter and just sort of being really clear, going back to the Department of Energy saying, is this really what you want? And being really clear on the task at hand. And then we framed sort of what were our principles on how to actually address this study. So what we've tried to do is establish the importance and the role of CCUS in the U.S., look at what we call the supply chain across carbon capture, use, and storage, and we'll come to a slide on that, and the drivers of success across a variety of different energy sources, sectors, and fuel types. As we said, as Secretary Perry asked us to do, we responded saying we will look at the economics, policy, and technology and focus on, again, his question of how do we actually move forward, what will it take? And the last request was provide a roadmap for deployment for the U.S. government, for industry, and all parties. So that's kind of the way we framed the study and the subsequent report that'll be coming out in about a month. So now let's talk about the who. So these studies are really interesting. They are designed to drive consensus, collaboration, to duke things out so that by the time you get to the government, you've already worked through a lot of issues. So to do that, our study, and this is the team that I chair, had 300 different participants. So the study team had people from 110 different organizations. Only about 30% of the study participants are from oil and gas. We have high CO2 emitting other industries like steel, cement, ethanol. Ethanol manufacture actually creates a great pure stream of CO2, something I didn't know when we started the project. We have participants from NGOs and other sort of organizations, a lot of academic participants because there's a huge amount of technology involved in moving forward with CCUS. And then we brought in financial folks because there are a number of financial enablers that will probably need to be seriously considered and triggered to actually move forward. So the team was pretty big. The team actually worked really well together. One of the things that I would say about carbon capture, use, and storage, or have said, is the people who want this to move forward are really a mixed bag of strange bedfellows. It's not a bad term, but it really, people who have a common interest in reducing greenhouse gases, specifically carbon dioxide. So I might be talking to Oxy one hour, the next I'm talking to a professor from Stanford, and the next I'll be on the phone with Environmental Defense Fund. All of those are members of the steering committee the working team that we are delivering the study. And we have a lot of great discussions. Okay. So Sarah did a fantastic job of setting up the dual challenge, but just to remind you, and maybe just on one slide sort of summarize what Sarah said, this study is all framed in this framework of the challenge of meeting energy growth. The bar chart on my right, your left, of this slide is similar to what Sarah showed. It's a range of different scenarios. These are from the BP Energy Outlook under different conditions, different policy assumptions, different regulatory frameworks. But what they do show, all of them show, is that by 2040, we expect energy demand to grow by roughly about 30%. So that is the energy demand. And again, as Sarah said, this is not really here in the US, where energy is probably likely to stay relatively flat, or energy use may even decline a bit, but globally this will be happening around the world. At the same time, and the diagram on the other side is, we need to be addressing the impacts of climate change. We believe that one of the ways to do that is by attacking greenhouse gases. In the case of CCUS, that's through the capture, storage, use of carbon dioxide. And what this chart complementary chart shows is sort of carbon dioxide in the red is under our more energy scenario, which is the highest energy increase on the bar chart. That just shows if nothing happens, CO2 use is going, or CO2 emissions will just continue to grow as they have been growing. I think there's probably not anybody in this room, in this state, in this country who would say that's really acceptable. So the other CO2 emissions are outcomes of the other energy scenarios that you see here. And what you can see is they're still not really attacking the CO2 emissions. They are just, with the exception of what we call the rapid transition, they are really just kind of status quo holding the own. So to do that, let's talk a little bit. So that's the dual challenge: more energy demand for the world, but the need to address climate change through reduction of greenhouse gases such as CO2. So to do that, let's just frame out, what is carbon capture, use, and storage, or carbon capture sequestration, carbon capture utilization. So there are as many different ways to look at this as there are ways to explain this acronym. We've chosen carbon capture, use, and storage. We think that's the most holistic. And when you break down that supply chain, it's really a series of technologies. There are technologies that capture CO2 from a wide range of sources. It's usually more efficient, more practical if you're looking at a high purity source. There's carbon, there are, in this state of technology, there's a tried and true technology that's been around for decades, that's amine. And then there are a number of promising technologies that need further development and testing to even get on the radar screen. Capture is really expensive. It's about 80% of the cost of almost any carbon capture project that we've sort of priced in our study using proven technology, and so those costs just need to be addressed. CO2 transportation. Occasionally, you'll have a carbon capture facility right over an EOR or a source that you can then capture right over a subsurface storage, or potentially in the future some kind of plant that will manufacture things out of that carbon, but that's going to be pretty rare. So most storage is done through pipeline, CO2 pipeline, and but CO2 can also be transported by truck, by rail, and by ship. CO2 use, I talked a little bit about that. That is actually the manufacture or the creation of products. It can be fuels, it can be fertilizers, it can be carbon nanotubes, it can be diamonds made out of your beloved's breath. Use is a really kind of interesting, fascinating, amazing potential use, future source, but right now the technologies are relatively immature and often done at relatively small scale. And then finally, CO2 storage. Storage other than in use is, in our study, is described really in two big ways. One is through enhanced oil recovery, as CO2 is injected into an existing oil field and used to recover additional oil resources that would be left in the ground. As that happens, CO2 is trapped in the subsurface and permanently stored in that reservoir. A big upside for CO2 storage in the U.S. is actually storage in what we say, what we call saline reservoirs, but they are usually sedimentary reservoirs that are very common in the U.S. This is a very promising place for CO2 storage to take in the U.S. However, we've only had 2 wells really permitted to do this so far, and only one's injecting. So just a quick look, this is the IEA World Energy Outlook, one of their scenarios, and it just shows that sort of all of the above approach to a clean energy portfolio, moving from sort of business as usual CO2 on the top part of this chart, and then reduction of CO2 on the bottom. And you can see energy efficiency, renewables, fuel switching, nuclear, all playing a role in reducing CO2 CCS on this particular model has just about the same role as nuclear in being able to abate things. So another thing that was really important for the U.S. in the study is we kept looking around like, who's the world leader? And we realized it's actually the United States. So we have over 4 decades of experience in enhanced oil recovery. There are 19 industrial scale projects in the world today. 10 of them are in the U.S. That's 80% of the world's capacity in carbon capture, use, and storage. We also have 85% of the world's CO2 pipelines. How is this enabled? It's enabled through a really good public-private partnership. The Department of Energy has been funding research over the last 20 years, doing deployment. We've also got some pretty great policy support. It could be better, and that'll be part of the recommendations of the study. And we have an established regulatory framework. Again, could be part of this improved, but it's there and it's good and promising. So what we did in my remaining we just check, 4.5 minutes. So we looked at a lot of studies and we said, CCUS, if you've been living in this world, there have been 2 sort of waves of CCUS is going to come in and it's going to work. And they both sort of ended in sadness and disappointment. So this time for real, we're looking at how do we actually move forward with carbon capture, use, and storage as part of the solution for lowering CO2. So what we thought would be different from all these other studies is we thought we've got to look at the economics. We've got to look at the market, what would enable this. We know it's expensive. We need very, very clear recommendations, policy, regulatory, and legal recommendations, financial recommendations, and we also need to look at what sort of, or make some at least recommendations on what sort of research and development the U.S. could consider growing and continuing to fund. And so to do that, what we did is we created a cost curve. I'm not going to be able to get into the details of this cost curve. You'll be able to see that when the study is released. But just to let you know a little bit about the process, we modeled almost 2,000 actual sources. So these are CO2 emitters in the U.S. These are stationary sources, which represent about half of the sources of the U.S. And they're power plants, they're cement plants, they're ethanol plants. And we worked across our team and across industry to establish costs. What would it take to deliver each of these as a bespoke project? We modeled that, and what you're seeing is on the y-axis here is cost, and on the x-axis it's sort of CO2 abated. And so what we do know about this is, overall, it's probably a good look at the portfolio. Any given project is going to vary on costs. As I said, about 80% of the costs here are in the capture, and within the team, we've been socializing our costs within our study committee, which is CEOs from primarily around the U.S. and academics, and we've heard our costs are way too high, and we've heard our costs are way too low. So the one thing we know is they're probably wrong, but this is a good way to sort of look at what it would really cost to move forward at scale. For us, at scale is about 500 million tons per year of CO2 captured. That's right where this arrow sits. And so what we have done is we've set up a series of recommendations that would start the U.S., their policy, regulatory, legal recommendations, and that would start us on moving forward. Thank you, Carol. And we've identified sort of phases of implementation, sort of a beginning phase that really builds off of 45Q, existing policy, and regulatory framework, just clarification, moving things forward, and that could start to really catalyze things. We then see a second phase that would require more aggressive actions in the U.S. policy space, and then a third phase. And so all of these will be spelled out very explicitly with probably well over 100 recommendations of who should be doing what to help move us forward in CCUS. The study timing is, as I said, we're socializing it right now. We will present the study to the Secretary of Energy December 12th. We hope that's Rick Perry. If not, it's Dan Brouillette, who's very familiar with this study. He is a co-chair on the study. And all the materials will be available through the National Petroleum Council website at that time. So just to close up, conclusions, we've got the dual challenge. We have the challenge of saying, how do we move forward with CCUS at scale? We think that that's going to require strong collaboration between industry and government, innovation, technology. So as I said, we've made a number of recommendations on future R&D investment and pilot demonstrations. It will require improved policies, incentives, and regulation, and again, understanding of the role that CCUS can play in by the public and key stakeholders, because it's not clearly understood. We can't even get the acronym right as our own team. So how we've got to move forward with explaining the benefits and the costs to a wide variety of policymakers and other stakeholders. So with that, I will just leave the podium sort of on time, and turn the floor back over to Carol. Thank you, guys.
Okay, so we have some time for questions, so we'll open it up to the audience. So if you can tell us your affiliation and who you want to direct your questions to. And do we have a microphone? Yeah, we have a microphone.
Okay, thanks.
Are these on? Or?
I think so.
My name is John Jemison. I'm actually the lawyer for the USAEE and the IAEE. But I thought it was a fabulous panel, and certainly 3 important and valid pathways we need to really understand and move forward on. I could take the time of everybody who's in line behind me and ask a bunch of questions, but I think I wanted to start with Shannon, because you went first, and nuclear is such an important source now of carbon-free energy. But I think the experience at Vogtle suggests that nobody is going to start another conventional light water reactor in the U.S. But I think the other part of conventional wisdom is we would be fools to keep taking existing reactors out of service. So that raises the question of the lifetime of the existing reactors and the issues of keeping them in service as we move towards 2050, and the time that it will require to reach some of the new technical designs and get them approved, get them into the market, get them generating power, and all this array of side products that are really attractive. But they're on the drawing board now, and that could be a long time. So how do we keep nuclear going at the degree to which we should, with existing reactors and getting those new technologies into the market?
Sure. It's a multi-part question, so I'll try to hit all of the pieces. Start with current fleet. So we have seen early retirements of current fleet plants that have remainder on their lifetime. So initial license for a nuclear plant is 40 years. Many extend that another 20 years. We have seen second license renewal applications as well that would take some plants to 80 years. Why is that not happening everywhere? We see many of the plants in the Midwest challenged in a deregulated market with low-cost natural gas and incentivized renewables. So number one, I think we need to levelize the playing field. If we want clean technology, we need to incentivize clean technology, not one technology over another. So that's one part of it. Keep them competitive, keep them operating, because we need that clean energy on the grid. We need it for many things. Several of those plants, as I mentioned, are also beginning to look at alternate revenue streams. Hydrogen production, for example, water production, depending on the region that it's located in. This changes the economics of the plant and can hopefully keep them viable. We expect to see those demonstration projects initially. The initial projects will be fed from excess electricity from those plants, potentially demonstrated within the next 3 years or so. But each of those is also looking at thermal integration, taking advantage of the high quality heat from a nuclear plant. So number one, we've got to keep those current fleet plants running. That is a step toward getting advanced reactors on the grid. You asked about timelines for advanced reactors. They're quite varied, and until we have one operating, there's always questions as to how realistic they are. As I mentioned, NuScale, it's a water-cooled reactor, but a very different approach, being a multi-module plant, much smaller individual units, factory manufacturing. The first plant for NuScale is expected to begin operation in 2026. That will be sited on the INL site in Idaho. However, it is a fully commercial plant. So that is one timeline. Microreactors are on a very aggressive schedule, with many of them claiming or seeking to demonstrate their first systems in 2023, 2024 timeline. We see injection of private funding. We see injection of funding from DOE as well as DOD to do that. It's unfortunate that we have some of the cost challenges with Vogtle that you mentioned. Those have crept very high. Schedule delays cause that to increase even more because of the cost of capital over time. That's going to just cause further increases. But if we look globally, we see ranges in the cost of nuclear anywhere as low as about $2,000 per kilowatt electric, up to what we're seeing with Vogtle on the order of 10 to 12,000. We're not sure where it's going to land yet. And in looking at the studies on that, really the biggest contributor to cost is how far were we on the completion of the design at the start of construction. And is this a first of a kind unit, which can be looked at as an investment, or is it a second or 10th of a kind unit? We've got to build plants, we've got to keep building, we've got to keep that continuous investment, not wait 25 years between plant builds, because that learning curve, we can't take advantage of then. So there's a lot of things that we see in other countries that we need to reflect here to ensure that those are implemented within reasonable timeframes to help solve our energy problems in the future.
So, go ahead.
Right. Thank you for the presentations. I'm Ray from Oak Ridge National Laboratories, and also a question about nuclears. For now, nuclear power plants almost act as base loads, but technically they can provide flexibility. They have ramping capabilities. Do you think in the energy transition, the nuclear power plants will be a source of flexibility to help integrate more renewable resource? Thank you.
Absolutely, because it's happening now. You pointed out very correctly that nuclear plants can flexibly operate. France has been doing it for many, many years. They've operated flexibly because of the large percentage of nuclear plants on their grid. And so that's just their standard mode of operation. In the U.S., we're seeing it more and more now. The Columbia Generating Station in Washington has operated flexibly on a seasonal basis due to large contributions from hydro in that region. The Exelon plants in the Midwest have begun operating with what they call advanced economic dispatch to avoid negative priced electricity and loss of revenue in that way. We see more and more plants beginning to look at flexible operation. These plants can easily operate within 80 to 100%, some down to as low as 70%. Depends on when it is during the fuel cycle. There's many approaches, whether those be control changes on the primary side or modifications on steam going to the turbines on the secondary side. So we're already seeing it happen. We will see it happen more and more. As we look at integrated energy systems, our baseline in comparing the revenue streams and economic profitability is flexible operation to accommodate variable renewables in the grid.
So go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much to the speakers. I have a question, Michael Craig, University of Michigan. A question for the last speaker on CCUS. It looked like a really cool report. I was hoping, one, if you could talk about how much value there is in the phased approach that you mentioned in terms of making the technology cost effective, and two, did you do a lot of storage state level analyses of pipeline siting policies and subsurface ownership?
So answer the second one first. We didn't do a lot of state-specific work. We did, in our original modeling, we actually started modeling, we actually have created pipelines, but every time we tried to kind of socialize them, people started going, well, your state has more than my state, and so we actually kind of just ended up reporting sort of numbers of miles of pipeline in the study and jobs created, and you're laughing because you know exactly what I'm talking about. So the first part of your question was?
How much does the phased approach matter? Do you actually get cost effective after you do the low capture cost sources, or are we going to be subsidizing them regardless of what order we go in?
Yeah, so the phased approach really kind of keys off of sort of what you can do here and now with high purity sources, existing policies, and there's a lot built in around 45Q, just tax credit, which is really clarifying that, and that kind of catalyzes things. And if you're living in that world, you know that that conversation is very live right now. And that first phase would actually, we capture about 25 million tons of CO2 per year in the US. That first phase, as we've modeled it, would kind of double that. The second phase is going to still relatively high purity sources, but you'd start to see more financial incentives in terms of access to financial instruments, maybe longer term project life, different sort of financial frame factors that other renewables have benefited from. That phase sort of doubles again the capacity and kind of moves us forward. And then to really, and all this would happen sort of in the first 15 years. So in terms of technology advances, I think we believe that you would see the many of a kind moving forward. You would see impacts of standardization of that learning curve, and we've modeled that into this amine-based cost curve. Then when you get to sort of that third phase, which would be sort of 15 to 25 years, in our model, you start to see continued incentivization to really start to capture the less pure sources. That's where you see some of the usual suspects that people are always trying to address. A lot of the hydrocarbon-based fuels really coming into play. So the phases are really around pragmatism about how quickly could you move forward and what are you asking of the government, and then about the challenges of the technology. The last thing I'll say, because Carol's probably like, is that we didn't factor a lot of technology improvement into our cost curve. I personally think it's going to be significant, and that we'll see that cost curve actually kind of flattening out or coming down just through kind of the normal advances that come when people focus on the development of technologies. So,
thank you.
Thanks.
So let's step up.
Yeah, thank you very much for this amazing panel. My name is Robert Idle from Rice University, and my question is related to CCUS. It's about CDR, carbon dioxide removal, basically capturing the carbon that's already in the air and putting it back in the ground or somewhere else. And as far as I'm concerned, as I'm informed, the largest and the only research facility about CDR is sponsored by Bill Gates and ExxonMobil. So can you elaborate on this topic? Whose job is it supposed to be to pay for this, and what the status of the policy and of the research?
So we, as a geologist and someone who works in more of a 50-year time frame, I have to say I'm like one of the big fans who doesn't really know very much about it. But we had a lot of debate in the team about that, and we realized there are people who don't support it at all, and they're looking at a very short time frame. The truth is that these direct air capture methods are they're really exciting. They're really promising. They are probably a longer-term solution because the technologies, if they're even proven, they're proven in tiny little factors. but that is one of the things I didn't mention earlier is carbon capture, use, and storage could be it's the only way we know of today that could help move the world forward in a negative emission scenario. Like we actually have to take more CO2 out of the air than we're actually producing on, and CDR would be one of the most exciting ways to actually do that. So to answer your question, once we got our kind of heads around the time frame and that can't we all get along type of thing, we have made requests to continue and increase federal funding and asked for continued interest and support of these longer term research methods, because they could be very exciting and very beneficial to helping us reverse this CO2 in the air.
So go ahead.
Hi, my name's Jackie Dowling. I'm at Caltech, and I am wondering, so yesterday at the CCS session, we talked about how to plan for assuming risk for storing CO2 under the ground for a very long time. And there was someone from North Dakota who talked about sort of splitting the risk between the state and I think the people doing it too. And I'm wondering how planning for these long-term risk of waste products is also related to nuclear waste, and how we're thinking about planning for assuming risk for products that we have to worry about for a millennial, a long time. So.
I'll make a quick comment. Shannon's so excited, it's going to be quick. We definitely have a lot of debate about the long-term liability, and certainly that before any major projects can move forward in carbon capture, use, and storage, they have to have an agreement on long-term liability and who's accountable for what. That being said, I think as you stated, the states will play a critical role in making sure that that's done in a fair and equitable way. There's still a lot of uncertainty in how monitoring should be done in the subsurface, how a plume of CO2 might stay or migrate in the subsurface. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done even to get ourselves into who takes hold of what. But the states will be absolutely critical in that conversation. I'll turn it over to Shannon.
So used nuclear fuel, nuclear waste, is one of the biggest questions that always comes up when we talk about advancing nuclear. I want to start by saying there's not that much of it. Because it is so energy dense, the entirety of the waste stream produced by the commercial nuclear plants in the US could be stacked on a football field and it would be less than 10 yards high. So there's not that much. Right now, that used nuclear fuel is stored on site at those plants, first in wet storage and then in dry storage casks. Ultimately, the federal government will take possession of that fuel when we have a long-term repository. There's actually $40 billion right now in a nuclear waste fund for that. Unfortunately, it's all caught up in politics. And I looked up the dates because Carol and I were having a lunch conversation. So Yucca Mountain was selected as the long-term repository location for the United States in 2002. Work was halted in 2010 due to questions on safety. The NRC restarted that analysis in 2014 to review all safety, environmental reviews, everything, and it was cleared. Everything met safety reviews. Now, what it waits for is a final hearing, and that requires funding from Congress. And it's caught up in that turmoil right now. It needs to be funded to have that hearing to move forward. But right now, Yucca Mountain is what legally we are supposed to use for long-term repository for nuclear fuel. There are other pathways. We could reprocess fuel. We used to do that in the US. France reprocesses fuel. That fuel can go into reactors and be burned. It can also be processed so that we have much smaller packages of waste materials that would have to be disposed of. There's also an ongoing process to look at consolidated interim storage facilities. And what that means is taking used fuel that's currently located at a number of different nuclear plant sites, some of which where the nuclear plant is no longer operating, so we call those orphaned sites, consolidate them into a single storage so we have a smaller risk profile and a much reduced number of locations. And we've learned from how Yucca Mountain didn't necessarily go the way that we thought it would, and we're doing consent-based siting processes. Communities are volunteering to be considered for that purpose, for those storage facilities. It brings in jobs, it brings in a lot of opportunity, but we're doing so in a way that there is a volunteer process and then an evaluation of suitability, as opposed to the government selecting and saying, this is good.
So, go ahead.
Hello, I'm Diego Rivera from the Asia Pacific Energy Research Center. Thank you very much for those brilliant presentations and for those very interesting insights on the reality and the portfolio of reducing these emissions on the U.S. But as you mentioned, you all three in your presentations, a lot of this growth is happening elsewhere. And that elsewhere is in the developing world, right? We're speaking of Southeast Asia, we're speaking of the Indian subcontinent, we're speaking of Latin America, Africa, etc. So in places like this where you have a much more set of complication for developing these technologies. Nuclear, how we do with nuclear? Should we develop nuclear in these places, right? So if CCUS it's a problem and it's problematic here, how much more expensive, how much more complicated in all terms would it be elsewhere? And even for gas, LNG in Southeast Asia, in India, in Bangladesh, it's struggling quite a bit to compete with other fuels. So in this sense, what is your take on achieving, on reducing this emission in such context where really most of the demand in the next coming years is coming? Thank you.
Point to Sarah.
Sure.
Thought you'd get out of it, didn't you?
Well, I think the challenges on all of those technologies is cost competitiveness in a way that works in a developing market framework and not just in a developed market framework. So it wouldn't matter which one we're talking about, but if the cost can't compete with coal or burning oil directly, then yeah, we're going to struggle to bring our developing country companions along with us on the mission to reduce emissions. In the case of natural gas, and I alluded to this, and you and I had a side conversation about this, what happens to evolve the LNG market and make it smaller scale and available, more flexible is critical for making that gas available in those smaller markets in Asia. And so I think market evolution across all of these opportunities will be important. That would be my take.
Thank you.
Just a quick addition, absolutely market competitiveness is a #1 component. When it comes to nuclear technologies, one of the questions that arises is safety and security of that system and the material associated with it. I mentioned a lot about the smaller designs that opens up opportunity for these developing regions, the security of these designs, the different operating modalities and some of the current fleet plants. But I'll also mention the International Atomic Energy Agency works very much with these countries to help them identify technology solutions. They don't prescribe solutions, but help identify what solutions may be appropriate for those locations, and then also provide monitoring of that so that we can be assured of the security of those materials once they are utilized in different countries. So my bottom line answer is yes, I think these technologies should be deployed there if they match the energy use needs. There are just different approaches with different technology solutions.
And I think just to round it out with carbon capture, use, and storage, it may not be the most pragmatic solution everywhere. It'll kind of depend on, how local is your storage source, what are your sources, but there will be places where it will make sense in the economic framework, as Sarah laid out, to do CCUS and potentially direct air capture or something if the site is a good spot ultimately for sort of a negative emissions place.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think that rounds out this session. I forgot to introduce myself. I think a lot of you know me. I'm Carol Dahl, Professor Emeritus of Mineral and Energy Economics and Senior Fellow of the Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines. And I'm very honored to be with these very talented professionals. And this is a case where I want to be a Me Too. So let's give these professionals a great hand.